So Claire has asked me to speak about production and biodiversity and landscape, community and personal resilience. And that's the R word that you hear an awful lot about. I think it's a bit like sustainability. If you draw a plot of the use of sustainability since Brundtland in 1982, it goes up like this, so that almost every second word now is sustainability, and I think we've lost track of the meaning. But I think resilience is taking the same path. So let's explore what that means. So what I'd like to do today is just give you a little bit of, just cover a couple of things, an understanding of resilience and why that's important as a land manager, and how systems come into that, and what do we mean by landscape, community and personal resilience. And then, as you will have guessed from our name, Soils for Life, we focus very much on soil as the fundamental underpinning of all of those things, and we'll talk to you a little bit about landscape functions. So, just a very brief introduction to us at Soils for Life. How many of you know of Soils for Life? Oh, okay, that's good. Soils for Life was founded about 10 years ago by Major General Michael Jeffrey, who was asked to do a review of Australia's major security issues. And the number one he came up with was soil. And soil in terms of continuing ability to live comfortably on this planet, in this country, to have adequate water, to have adequate food, and all the other ecosystem services that we need just to survive. So out of that, he hassled 5 successive prime ministers to get soil on the national agenda. And unfortunately, he passed away late last year, but we're very excited to have our very first national soil strategy. So soil is now on the national agenda as a major issue, a major priority for Australia. So what do we do at Soils for Life? We are a national organisation, we're a not-for-profit, a charity, and we promote good soil health, but we do it very much from the ground up. So we work particularly with local landholders and groups. We work with Landcare, we work with NRM, we work with individual landholders, we work with a whole range of organisations to try to build on-ground community and farmer support mechanisms. One of the things we've just kicked off is a project in South Australia called South Australian Paddock Labs, as in laboratories. So we're taking the research very much as Colin mentioned. There's a lot of research happening on his farm, so we're following that lead, and we're starting up this kind of research innovation project with a group of farmers in the Eyre Peninsula who are now in a situation where their soil's exhausted, their input costs are getting really high, their yields are dropping, and they're struggling. So they called us up and said, can you help us? So we've got this grant to go and work with them. We also see the importance of connecting research to practical on-ground activities. As Colin pointed out, he and his friend, I like the picture of the beer. In my case, it's a bottle of red wine. That sort of innovation, you get these startling results, and you don't want everyone to, and I know what you're saying, you know, people go, oh no, you must have made that up, it can't be real, or you must be mad. But then you actually want to understand why it happened and validate the fact that it really is successful and it really works, so that you can actually share that with other people. So we're very interested in pursuing that focus on getting research onto the ground to work with local producers. So just a little bit about me. My background, I'm an agricultural scientist by training. I come from a Queensland rural family, don't hold it against me. I grew up on and around farms, and agriculture has been really part of my life for my whole life. I did a good old muddy boots degree at University of Queensland. And then I ended up in the land care movement, and I was kind of like, hang on, so there's environmental management and ecology over here, and there's agricultural science over here. How about we bring the two together? How about we think about agriculture as an ecological system? And then I went and did a PhD in human ecology at the Fenner School at ANU, and it all goes from there. So I think that seeing your farmers in ecology, as Cole said, is really important. But my job today is to talk a little bit about resilience. So how many of you would be able, any ideas about what resilience is? Can anybody suggest?
Stickability.
Stickability, riding through the hard times. Yep. Recovery. Yep.
Just being a farmer. You've got to be resilient.
You've got to be resilient to be a farmer. Spot on. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So this is a definition that comes from the Stockholm Resilience Centre, which I think is kind of handy because it has a few useful words in there. So it talks about the capacity of a system to deal with change and continue to develop. So it's not just about staying the same, it's about increasing your ability to stick with it, to ride through the tough times. So you're withstanding shocks and disturbances. So the Boffins call those shocks and disturbances droughts, floods, fire, market variability and social change. I think farmers have much more graphic terms for these things. And it's also about using these events as a means to catalyse renewal and innovation. I think Colin's a perfect example of that. A catastrophic bushfire has led him into a flowering of innovation and renewed resilience. So now you're all comfortably sat down after your cup of coffee. I'm going to make you get up again. So James is just about to come around and present you with some post-it notes and a pen most importantly. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, and we don't actually have a whiteboard, but we're going to use these handy windows that we have over here. So I think perhaps this window over on the side here, or both those sets of windows on the side. So what I'd like you to put down on the post-its is, what does resilience mean for you? So for you in your current situation, in your life. And that can be from a landscape perspective, from a community perspective, and from your own personal perspective, because we also need personal resilience. So I'd ask you to write one idea on each post-it note. So you can write you can write up to 3, but just one idea per post-it, and try to keep it down to 3 or 4 words if you can. Try not to write War and Peace, because none of us will be able to read it. So thanks for doing that. So just quickly whizzing through these. There's an awful lot of them that talk about being able to deal with change. And that's actually, there's a lot of them about dealing with change, which is really interesting. Because as we know, particularly in the last few years, we've had to deal with an awful lot of that. And then we've got issues like climate change, some of which is not predictable. There was one there that said foresight. Anyone like to comment on what you meant by foresight? I thought that was a very interesting one.
Yeah, that was mine. And I think I'm just sort of thinking about when we do talk often, I also was thinking about, the ability to adapt to change, but it's trying to see as we all know, it's very hard to know what's happening, but trying to think about what is happening is a way of, I think, helping you to be in a better state to deal with those sort of things. And if you're in a better state to deal with the different changes, then I think that helps in terms of your resilience.
So being much more mindful of the change that's happening and thinking forward.
And looking forward.
Yep. Great, thanks.
Rather than trying to just adapt when things...
Look backwards at what's already happened. Look forwards. That's a great one, thanks. What else have we got there, James?
So I've observed that there's probably 2 main groups here. There's a group which is sort of about the landscape and how ecology functions and physical resilience. And there's a bigger group, some of which are still over here, about dealing with change. Dealing with change, thinking about change. We've got open to new ideas, ability to change, mentally, emotionally, physically, getting better over time, adaptability. Now, we've also got another one here that goes with foresight, is looking into the future. Somebody wrote as well. So those are two that kind of stand out. And then we've got not too many, probably about 6 or 7 about natural systems, but almost everything else about human resilience.
Great, thanks James. So for me, this was me. I thought I'd better tell you what I thought resilience was. So I actually want to live in a resilient landscape that continues to provide food, livelihoods and other ecosystem services. I'm a mad keen bushwalker, so, and I really love getting out, and I've just come back from doing the Three Capes walk in Tasmania, which was fabulous. I'm concerned about increasing natural disasters and climate change. And I also want to be, I'm a farm girl and I'm used to being in a local rural community, and I want to be part of a community that's safe, connected and enjoyable to live in. And another one from a personal level is making sure I've got a little bit of cash in the bank, that I'm paying off my mortgage, and that I've got the energy levels to deal with any adverse events that happen to me personally. I won't go in, there's an awful lot of science around resilience which I don't think is very useful to share, well, not really relevant to share here, but just to show you that an awful lot of scientists around the world are talking an awful lot about resilience, because it's a big issue globally as population increases and we gradually dismantle our ecosystems. These are the principles that the Stockholm Resilience Centre have popped up. And they talk about maintaining diversity and redundancy, managing connectivity, managing slow variables and feedbacks. I'll explain a few of these later as I go through the presentation, but I just want to give you this overview. Foster complex adaptive systems thinking. You're probably wondering what the hell that is. I'll try and explain it. Encourage learning, broaden participation. I think that foresighting and the looking forward was very much about learning. So it's you're learning from what's already happened. You're learning. A friend of mine who's a farmer who's trying a whole lot of new things. His father's, he's working with his father, and he said to his father, "Oh God, Dad, I made a real mess last year. You must think I'm a bloody idiot." And the father said, "No, son, I'll think you're a bloody idiot if you do the same thing next year." So principle 6 is broadening participation, and then polycentric governance. Difficult term, but weird term, but I'll explain that to you. But I think most importantly, underpinning all of this stuff is what is a system. And I'm a complex systems scientist, so human ecology and complex systems are the two areas that I focus my PhD on. And they have a whole lot of characteristics. So can anybody tell me what a system is for them? There is a point to this. I'm not just giving you an academic lesson. Any ideas about what a system is, or what? Yes. Yes, something that has inputs and outputs. So they're generally composed of lots of different components which all interact. So the landscape is a system. We have social systems. Think about the school system. That's a system because it has lots of different components that interact. There's students and teachers and buildings and administrative input and funding from government. So there's a whole interconnected system that makes up our education system. So today we're really talking about down on the farm. We're talking about managing a landscape, and that's what we call a social ecological system. And one of the things that we've tended to forget in recent years as we become more and more, particularly city dwellers, divorced from the landscape we live in, is that we are intricately connected to landscapes. We can't survive without our ecosystems. We're just part of it. We're not actually separate to it. And that's an important thing to remember, and I think Colin's given some really good examples of that. So what is a system? That's our planetary system. So systems can be as big or as small as you want, and you can define boundaries for them, so you can have a global system. The Upper Murrumbidgee catchment is a system, and it has lots of little sub-catchment systems within it. The landscape, different characteristics of the landscape is a system, and here we are in Goolabri. So some of the characteristics of complex systems, they have things called feedback loops. And in a farming system, you end up being very familiar with these. So if you're grazing your land and you keep on grazing it and it doesn't rain, the grass gets shorter and shorter and you eventually end up with bare ground. And then when the rain comes, you don't get grass because it's all gone. So that's a positive feedback loop where you're gradually running down your pasture. The example I was going to give you, and I do this a bit tentatively, is the mouse plague. So we had the drought that sort of ended in early 2020, and we had very little grass growth, etc. Then we had the Black Summer bushfires, which was another shock on the landscape. Then it was followed by a lot of rain. We've had some very good seasons. We've got a bumper wheat crop. Things have turned around. We're in a different part of the cycle. So we've got an abundance of food available in the landscape, and guess what happens? You get an explosion of a population of mice. So one of the feedback loops here is that having a mouse plague means that they're going to eat up all of that available food, and you're going to end up back in this drought-like state. But one of the things to consider is, I'm not a population dynamics person, but people study how populations of mice and grasshoppers and things rise and fall, and you get a sort of a sigmoid curve. And if you've had a period of of lack, of drought, of fire, etc., and then you suddenly have a flush of growth, it's perfect conditions for those things to flourish. So it's thinking about how we can, rather than just thinking about how we control the mice, thinking about how we manage our ecological systems so that we don't end up with these kinds of out of control plagues. I was just visiting a farm in Tasmania last week, and the farmer said to me, well, I don't control weeds. I'm not interested in controlling weeds. I'm interested in managing weeds. So, and he said to me, weeds are not the result of a lack of application of herbicide, they're a result of my management decisions. And I thought that was a really great statement, because it's illustrating that the weeds are the symptom, they're not the cause. So they tend to occur in disturbed areas where you've got bare ground, and if you go and spray them, then you're reducing it back to bare ground, and what are you going to get? More weeds. Now, I'm oversimplifying all of this because I'm trying to cover it in a short time. There's another emerging science that's coming out around the pandemic. So the pandemics actually fostered quite a lot of interesting thinking. So there's this Coalition for Preventing Pandemics, which is a coalition of various universities and think tanks around the world. And they're focusing on issues of loss of ecological health and function, loss of forests and other habitat, and a loss of the checks and balances and redundancy in ecosystems. And this decline, they are saying, allows diseases to cross over between animals and humans more readily. So we've always had what we call zoonotic diseases, so Q fever, brucellosis, most flus, bird flu, they jump between species, so particularly farm species. But some of these things like the coronavirus are just a little bit more scary and serious. And rather than getting paranoid about the Chinese, though there might be other reasons to do that, they're actually looking at some of the underlying issues, the actual causes rather than the symptoms of the pandemics, because I think we haven't seen the last. This is not going to be the last pandemic we have. So they're really trying to come to grips with some of the ecological complex systems issues. So that's really just that's just a few examples, and that's way, way away from the farm, but I just thought they were good examples of why systems thinking is a really productive way to think about how we live on this planet. So the essential element in all terrestrial social ecological systems is soil. And you knew I'd say that because I'm from Soils for Life. But I think at the moment we've reached a moment where we're suddenly more aware of the importance of soil, and we're also aware of the damage we've done, not just in Australia but globally. So FAO reports that erosion carries away 25 to 40 billion tonnes of topsoil every year globally. And this means if we don't take action, soil losses are projected to be equivalent to removing 1.5 million square kilometres of arable land by 2050. So that's 1.5 square kilometres, million square kilometres. That's a lot of land. And it's actually roughly the total amount of arable land that India has. And India has a lot of arable land. So this just gives you an idea of the enormity of the problem we're dealing, not just on our own properties, that our own properties and farms are a microcosm of what's happening globally. So I'd just like to briefly mention the National Soil Strategy because we're quite excited about this because I think there is some money attached to it. We'd like it to have been more, but I think this is a real step change for us to help us build on all the hard work we've been doing in land care and other movements over the years. So I just wanted to put this in here. Healthy soils are central to delivering resilience to climate change and natural disasters, meeting our emission reduction targets, growing our agricultural industry and securing human health, food and water security, biodiversity and economic growth. So that's a pretty big claim. So that's pretty much everything. Human health, food and water security, biodiversity and economic growth. Okay, so, and the thing that I really like in the National Soil Strategy is this one in the middle, empowering soil innovation and stewards. That's you guys. And that's really important to me because you are the people who are at the ground level, who are eyeballing your soil and your landscapes every day. And empowering and providing you with the tools and resources to manage your land is absolutely critical. These are also important, prioritising soil health and strengthening knowledge and capability. But for us, this is the one I'm particularly excited about. So what does it mean to be a soil steward? So sustaining soil health, but better still actually rebuilding it. So we've, I don't have any figures for you, but our soil loss in Australia since white settlement has been huge. I see plenty of places around the Canberra area where there's literally no topsoil left. And to the extent where the subsoil on the hill slopes is now the topsoil on the flats. And that's 200 years of managing land but not really understanding. And as Colin said, we kind of ignored a lot of the wisdom that we could have learnt from the Indigenous peoples of Australia. And how would we do that? Through landscape literacy, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Applying resilience principles, which I gave you before, and thinking in terms of systems. Thinking in terms of the interconnections of everything. So this is a diagram we use at Soils for Life quite a bit. It's just a really simple diagram because the problem with complex systems is they're complex and they're hard to understand. So we try to think about them in terms of components. So I don't know if any of you had those kaleidoscopes when you were kids. So depending how you turn them around, you get a different view. So this is kind of like our complex systems kaleidoscope. So whichever way you turn it round, you get a different view into the system that is your landscape. So let's just start with soil. So soil actually contains more biodiversity. What do they say? In a teaspoon of soil, there's more biodiversity than people on the planet.
Something like that.
Something like that, yes.
Huge number of microbes.
A lot of microbes. A lot of stuff going on. But then the next thing to do is to add a plant. So one thing soils don't like to be without is plants, and that's for a whole range of reasons. So let's just talk a little bit about that. So the first aspect of my 5-point landscape function diagram is the solar energy cycle. So all of the energy we have comes from the sun, even oil and gas, which is basically just plant matter that's been pushed underground and turned into coal or whatever. So plants are a pretty remarkable little piece of technology. They contain these little chloroplasts, which are the most efficient photovoltaic cells we have. And those plants then, they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and everyone's talking about how to do that better at the moment. They turn that into sugars, push that down into their roots, and then they exude those carbohydrates to their roots to feed the soil microorganisms. And to build root mass. So if you pull up a plant on your farm and look at the roots, you'll notice with some of them that they're really, really hairy. They're like Rastafarian dreadlocks, Nicole Masters calls them. And that's actually the mycorrhizal fungi which are sticking onto the roots and which are really enhancing the function of those roots. And they're able to do that because the plants feed them. So it's a symbiotic relationship. So I just put this diagram up because I think it might help answer one of the questions that Colin was asked earlier, which is about how much should you graze plants. So up the top here, we have a plant that's been grazed down quite low. Now look at the proportion of roots to the proportion of leaf. So the leaf is the stuff that actually captures the carbon dioxide and turns it into sugars, and then pushes it down to develop the root mass. And the root mass works with the microbes to deal with other issues of soil nutrition, uptake water, all of the other things that the plant needs to survive. So if you cut off all the growing tips, all its ability to generate energy, what happens? You lose you lose root mass. Because the poor old plant can't photosynthesize to produce more leaf, so it eats its own roots. So you get a significant loss in root mass to start regrow, so you've got less resilience in that plant. Whereas down here, if you graze it less and you've still got some green tips there, you're only going to lose a small amount of your root mass when it starts to regrow, and you're going to get a much better result in the end. That's a very simplistic diagram. It's far more complex than that, but I think that just gives you an idea of the importance of roots. This is a standard growth curve for foragers. So we talk about the sigmoid growth curve, and the first phase is when the plant's just germinating and putting out a few leaves, and then it goes into phase 2, which is the rapid growth phase. And then phase 3 is when it seeds, it starts to senesce, you start to get browning off, etc. So the optimal time to graze is during that phase 2. And there's RCS and other people do all sorts of courses on how to graze most effectively to maximise your plant cover and your root mass and to get the best condition from your animals. But that just gives you an idea about the question that was asked about grazing management. When should you stop grazing and how long should you rest it?
When you get into phase 3,
yep.
does the root mass also decrease?
It depends. Yeah, it depends on the species. Yes, they do. So you actually want to keep it in more in this phase. Yep. Unless you're wanting to harvest the seed, like Colin does, and particularly if it's a summer active, if it's a seasonally active species, it'll senesce off, but it'll keep quite a lot of its root material ready to spring up the next season when the conditions, when the temperature and the moisture, etc., are right for it. So it really depends a bit on the species you're talking about. But yes, you want to keep as much of that there as possible. The downside of this is you get a lot of browning off. And I come from Queensland, where you don't get much winter rainfall. So we never made hay. We left feed standing in the paddock and we grazed it off and we put in lick blocks and a couple of supplements. Down here, we tried to do it down here, but it rains in winter. So you end up with, it all goes black, it oxidises and you lose a lot of it. So you can't, so there's a whole lot of different complexities around how you manage those plants. But I think one of the other important things here is you actually want senescing leaves. You actually want leaves dying off because that's creating the mulch on the ground. And your grazing animals actually trample that down into the ground, so that creates that protective mulch layer. And keeping that protective layer over soil is really important. So I guess none of you get up and put on your swimming costume in a -2-degree morning and race outside because you want to actually have protective warm clothing. The soil's the same. So you want to minimise the temperature variations on your soil and you need to keep it nicely rugged up. So there's a really nice video on the Soils for Life website. How am I going for time? There's a really nice video on the Soils for Life website which Charlie Maslin, who's a regenerative farmer up on in the Monero, he talks about differences in soil temperature based on ground cover or bare soil. So as a kid running around the farm barefoot, you certainly didn't run on the ploughed paddocks because they were as hot as Hades on a 45-degree day. Dynamic ecosystem communities. So this is one that confuses everybody. So you need to maintain biodiversity in your system. So having a pure monocultures without the diversity of species, and Colin talked about the diversity of insects and other creatures, having trees, having understory plants, having native vegetation remnants, all of these things contribute to the resilience of your system. It gives you buffering capacity when things get tough, when it gets dry or too wet and so on. But one of the really important parts of this is the soil biota. And we're seeing more and more evidence that managing your soil biota and your above ground diversity actually helps you counteract some of the major crop and plant diseases that have troubled us in Australian agriculture. And actually I worked in the Middle East for quite a while and we had a huge outbreak of wheat rust. And what we discovered was that the old land races, which are very heterogeneous, which are very diverse species, with a lot of different genetic material, they withstand those attacks much better. Whereas the high-performing, very consistent wheat crops that they were growing, and the fact that they were getting rid of all of the buffering areas, the vegetation remnants, etc., was really helping the rust to spread dramatically. Okay, so the next thing is another part of the answer to the question about why roots are so important and why plants are sacrificing sugars to feed plant microbes and the soil biodiversity, the soil ecology. One of the reasons they do that is because of the importance of microorganisms in feeding the roots all of the minerals and microelements that plants need. So I won't go into that, but a lot of the minerals are already there in the parent material, as Colin said. Nitrogen comes out of the atmosphere. We have a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere. and that gets pulled down into the soil through nitrogen-fixing legumes. The other point that Colin made was the need to have a variety of species, because every species has a different root profile. And Colin mentioned the daikon radish. It's got a nice deep taproot which can whack through a compaction layer, and you end up with a very diverse profile of roots. And different roots operate with different fungal relationships, so those sorts of things are all really important. Let's come to the water cycle. This is a really critical one. So back in my young days when I was an agronomist out in central Queensland, at the end of the cotton season, it was like clear everything off, kill all the weeds, because we don't want to lose all that subsoil moisture. And it kind of didn't make sense, because it's 45 degrees heat, and God knows what the soil temperature is, you couldn't walk on it. So what you're ending up with is a lot more evaporation. Whereas if you've got ground cover, you still have transpiration, but you still have that protective layer to keep the soil temperature down and so on. And I think the thing we forget about soil is it's one of the best water storage devices we have. We can store in healthy soil with a lot of soil organic matter, a lot of carbon, a lot of water. And that's another way of developing resilience against drought and also against flood. Because if you can increase the infiltration rate of your soil, then you're not going to get the bad effects of flooding. And I think James, after lunch, is going to talk a little bit about some of those characteristics of soils and how you can look at it and measure it on your property. Okay, so I'm whizzing through these really quickly. So I think the other one that we tend to forget about is the human and the social, the community and the personal stuff. This is really important. How am I going for time, Claire?
It's 10 to 12.
I've got 10. Okay, I'll finish up really quickly. Yep, good, I'll finish up. Okay, so this is really important, and this is why you're all here today at the Upper Murrumbidgee Catchment Network. Because it's interacting with other people, talking to them, sharing ideas, sharing knowledge, listening to people talk. This is how you build your resilience and your knowledge, that learning that you need, and share ideas and have that kind of support. We're very social creatures. So that's our 5 landscape functions. I'll pull up there.
Thank you very much, Liz. Again, I haven't got your mug, but I will send it to you. So I've got you a plant.
Oh, thank you very much.
And I will give James his plant in anticipation of your presentation this afternoon before everyone disperses. So thank you very much, Stewards for Life, for joining us. Did you want to say a few words before?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you now.
Okay, yeah,
Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely, that's fine. Let's just thank Liz again. Thank you.